In the grand tapestry of intellectual history, few figures stand as luminous and enduring as John Stuart Mill, a titan whose voice has echoed through the corridors of philosophy, political theory, and ethics for over a century and a half. Mill was not merely a thinker bound to the arcane discussions of academic elites, but a philosopher of the people, dedicated to grappling with the most fundamental questions of human liberty, individuality, and the pursuit of happiness. At a time when the world was wrestling with the tensions between tradition and progress, Mill emerged as a vanguard. This nuanced radical sought to reconcile the need for personal autonomy with the imperatives of collective well-being. Born into an environment of intellectual rigor, Mill's formative years were shaped by the intense tutelage of his father, James Mill, and the formidable influence of Jeremy Bentham, the founding figure of utilitarianism. Their presence imbued in Mill both an unyielding commitment to rational inquiry and a profound sense of social responsibility. Yet Mill's journey was not a linear progression from student to sage. It was marred by personal tribulations, including a harrowing crisis of mental health, which forced him to question the very foundations upon which his philosophy had been built. And from this crucible of doubt and despair emerged a renewed Mill, one who possessed both the clarity of logic and the depth of compassion. Central to Mill's enduring legacy is his iconic treatise on liberty, a work that codifies his passionate advocacy for freedom of thought, expression, and action. Through this classic text, Mill articulates the need to safeguard the dignity of the individual, even in the face of prevailing social norms and state authority. His harm principle, a concept so elegant in its simplicity, continues to serve as a guiding light for those seeking to define the legitimate boundaries of personal freedom. Moreover, Mill's relationship with Harriet Taylor catalyzed a transformation in his emotional and intellectual outlook, inspiring him to champion the cause of women's rights and expand the contours of liberal thought. Before we dive in, make sure to subscribe and hit that like button to support the channel. And don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you never miss an audiobook that could change your life. Now let's begin. Enjoy. Chapter 1. The Birth of a Thinker, Early Life and Education. John Stuart Mill was born on May 20th, 1806, into a world steeped in intellectual ferment and social transformation. The son of James Mill, a Scottish philosopher, historian, and economist, John's earliest environment was anything but ordinary. His father, a close associate of Jeremy Bentham, was fiercely committed to the principles of utilitarianism and exerted an extraordinary degree of control over young John's upbringing. From the tender age of 3, John was immersed in a regime of disciplined study, his daily routine meticulously orchestrated to nurture an exceptional mind. The Mill household, located in the bustling heart of London, was a crucible of intellectual discourse. Instead of playmates and idle amusements, John's companions were the tomes of history, mathematics, logic, and political economy. James Mill adopted an educational philosophy that rejected traditional schooling in favor of home instruction. He believed that formal institutions dulled the natural curiosity of the mind, stymied the development of independent thought, and reinforced social prejudices. Thus, John's education unfolded as a rigorous experiment, one that aimed to cultivate an unbiased intellect, unfettered by superstition or custom. By the age of 8, John had already mastered the basics of Greek and Latin, immersing himself in classical literature. He studied the works of Plato, Xenophon, and Herodotus, grappling with the foundational ideas of Western civilization. Logic and mathematics were equally prioritized, as James Mill believed these disciplines provided the scaffolding for clear and precise reasoning. John's proficiency quickly surpassed that of children far older than himself. Yet the relentless intensity of his studies meant that his childhood was marked by a conspicuous absence of leisure and social interaction. Despite, or perhaps because of, such rigor, young Mill developed a voracious appetite for knowledge. His father encouraged him to summarize, analyze, and critique every subject encountered. At 12, he was teaching his siblings, offering distilled versions of history and logic that reflected not only comprehension, but a budding capacity for original thought. This emphasis on critical engagement would become a hallmark of Mill's intellectual style, as he learned to approach ideas with both systematic scrutiny and openness to revision. Notably, Mill's education was imbued with a definite moral purpose. James Mill envisioned John as the instrument through which utilitarianism could be advanced and refined, a prodigy poised to realize the promise of rational social progress. To this end, lessons were not abstract or isolated. They were invariably tied to larger questions of utility, happiness, and justice. Political economy, jurisprudence, and ethics were threaded throughout his curriculum, preparing John to scrutinize the policies and institutions that governed society. However, this extraordinary upbringing was double-edged. While it endowed John Mill with prodigious intellect and discipline, it also came at a personal cost. The absence of maternal affection. His mother played little role in his education, and the intense pressure to excel placed strains upon his emotional development. Mill's occasional recollections of loneliness foreshadowed the psychological struggles he would confront in later life. In sum, Mill's early years set the stage for a life dedicated to thought, reform, and the relentless pursuit of truth. The foundational experiences of his childhood, shaped by both privilege and privation, would inform his lifelong commitment to reason, liberty, and the betterment of humanity. As the subsequent chapters reveal, Mill's journey was not one of static genius, but of continual evolution, a mind perpetually in search of freedom, justice, and the ideal conditions for human flourishing. Chapter 2. The Making of a Philosopher. Influences from Bentham and his father. The intellectual development of John Stuart Mill cannot be disentangled from the formative influences of two towering figures, his father, James Mill, and Jeremy Bentham. Together, they constituted the core of the utilitarian movement, a rationalist philosophy committed to maximizing happiness and minimizing suffering. Under their stewardship, young Mill was entrusted with a mission to cultivate an analytical mind capable of contributing to the advancement of society. James Mill's approach to education was as ambitious as it was exacting. He envisioned his son as the culmination of his philosophical ideals, pressing John to not merely inherit but surpass the intellectual legacy of his generation. Bentham, meanwhile, represented the theoretical heart of utilitarianism. His principles, rooted in the greatest happiness of the greatest number, infused every aspect of Mill's instruction. Both men fostered in John a mode of thought that was logical, empirical, and uncompromising in its quest for utility. From early adolescence, Mill was introduced to Benthamite philosophy with an intensity that bordered on zealotry. He pored over Bentham's voluminous writings, absorbing arguments on law, government, and moral calculus. Bentham's rejection of natural rights, his advocacy for legislative reform, and his belief in the quantification of pleasure and pain became foundational pillars of Mill's education. These studies were supplemented by nightly discussions with his father, wherein John was challenged to critique, defend, and refine the utilitarian framework. Yet, if Bentham supplied the blueprints for rational inquiry, James Mill provided the engine. The elder Mill's commitment to rigorous logic, systematic analysis, and empirical evidence shaped every facet of John's intellectual practice. He fostered habits of mind that prized precision, skepticism, and a relentless pursuit of clarity. This became evident in John's early writings, which displayed an extraordinary capacity to dissect arguments, weigh evidence, and synthesize ideas across disciplines. However, Mill's relationship with his philosophical mentors was not one of blind devotion. As he matured, he recognized the limitations of Bentham's utilitarian calculus, its indifference to the nuances of individual experience. its tendency to reduce moral life to mere arithmetic. Through prolonged reflection and engagement with divergent viewpoints, Mill came to realize that the mechanical Benthamite approach, compelling as it was, failed to account for the qualitative dimensions of human flourishing. He would later expand upon these insights, introducing the concept of higher and lower pleasures in his own formulation of utilitarian theory. The intellectual climate of Mill's adolescence was further enriched by contact with other philosophers and reformers, including David Ricardo and Thomas Macaulay. Engaging with these thinkers allowed Mill to situate Benthamism within a broader landscape of ideas, granting him the flexibility to adapt, critique, and innovate. It was through these interactions that Mill developed a willingness to confront orthodoxy, entertain dissent, and cultivate a genuinely pluralistic outlook. Despite the intensity of his education, Mill's immersion in utilitarian dogma engendered a spiritual crisis, a crisis of the mind that called into question the adequacy of rationalism alone. This pivotal juncture would ultimately propel Mill beyond the confines of Benthamite philosophy, leading him towards a more holistic vision of liberty, individuality, and happiness. Nevertheless, the imprint of his father and Bentham remained indelible, shaping the contours of his intellectual legacy. Thus, the making of Mill as a philosopher was a process marked by discipline, challenge, and critical growth. The utilitarian scaffold provided both a foundation and a limitation. It was Mill's willingness to interrogate and transcend these constraints that enabled him to become one of the 19th century's most original and influential thinkers. Chapter 3: The Crisis of the Mind, Mill's Struggle with Depression. In the annals of philosophical history, intellectual crises often serve as transformative junctures, prompting profound reassessment and growth. For John Stuart Mill, such a reckoning arrived in his early 20s, catalyzing a dramatic shift in his worldview and ultimately shaping the future direction of his thought. Beneath his prodigious achievements and rigorously cultivated intellect lay a fragile psychological foundation, one frayed and strained by the near-mechanical pursuit of rational ideals. Mill's crisis of the mind was not simply an episode of despair, but a pivotal moment of existential reckoning. The seeds of Mill's crisis were sown in the very soil of his upbringing. The relentless pressure to learn, excel, and fulfill the utilitarian mission instilled in him habits of discipline, focus, and analysis. But it also engendered deep emotional alienation. By the age of 20, having internalized the doctrines of Bentham and his father, Mill found himself at the crossroads of purpose and passion. He had become, in his own words, a reasoning machine, capable of dazzling feats of intellect, but fundamentally unmoored from the emotional wellsprings of meaning. The crisis came to a head in 1826, when Mill faced an unnerving loss of interest in the very project that had defined his existence. The question struck with relentless force: suppose that all your objects in life were attained. Would this be a great joy and happiness to you? To his dismay, Mill's honest answer was negative. The greatest happiness of the greatest number, a formula that had structured his thinking since childhood, suddenly appeared hollow, devoid of resonance or vitality. The emotional void exposed the limitations of an education grounded in abstract utility, shining a harsh light on the frailty of rationalism divorced from sentiment. For months, Mill was assailed by feelings of apathy, anxiety, and depression. Literature, which had once offered solace, now seemed inaccessible. Social engagements, though rare, became burdensome. He feared that his inability to feel was not a transient disorder, but a flaw intrinsic to his nature, a consequence of having been manufactured for philosophical utility rather than allowed to grow in spirit. The specter of depression cast a pall over his future, sowing doubts about his capacity for happiness and his fitness for the task to which He had been relentlessly groomed. It was during this period of darkness that Mill encountered the works of romantic poets, Wordsworth above all. The emotional sincerity and celebration of nature found in Wordsworth's verse struck a chord long dormant within Mill. He recognized, in the lines of poetry, the possibility of a life enriched by feeling, imagination and beauty. Poetry restored to Mill the faculties of pleasure and sympathy, helping him to conceive of well-being as a multidimensional experience rather than a mere aggregation of utility. The recovery was gradual but crucial. Mill began to embrace the importance of the culture of the feelings, an idea that would profoundly shape his later philosophy. Mill's crisis underscored the inherent limitations of Benthamism and, more broadly, of any system that prioritizes abstract rationality at the expense of emotional development. In the aftermath of his depression, Mill resolved to integrate feeling and intellect, reason and imagination. He recognized that human flourishing is contingent upon both the freedom to think and the capacity to experience, both autonomy and connection. The mechanical view of human nature, he realized, was inimical to happiness. Without pleasure in both individual and communal forms, life becomes sterile and empty. This reconciliation of reason and emotion marked a turning point in Mill's intellectual journey. He reoriented his philosophical outlook to favor not only utility, but also the cultivation of individuality, creativity, and sympathy. His subsequent works reflect this evolution, offering a vision of liberty that is grounded in pluralism, tolerance, and the acknowledgement of complexity in human experience. Mill's struggle with depression serves as a testament to the transformative power of adversity. Rather than succumbing to despair, he emerged renewed, capable of championing a richer, more humane vision of freedom. The crisis of the mind became paradoxically the liberation of the spirit, a necessary scourge that catalyzed insight, compassion, and the drive for reform. Through pain and reflection, Mill advanced not only as a philosopher, but as a fully realized human being. Chapter 4. The Awakening of Emotion. Harriet Taylor and the Power of Love. In the pantheon of philosophical relationships, few have provoked as much debate, adulation, and intrigue as the partnership between John Stuart Mill and Harriet Taylor. Far more than a romantic attachment, their alliance constituted an intellectual collaboration that reshaped the contours of Mill's thought and imbued his work with new depths of emotion, empathy, and radicalism. Harriet Taylor was, by all accounts, Mill's intellectual equal, a woman whose mind and spirit enriched his philosophical pursuits and whose influence reverberated throughout his mature works. Their acquaintance began in 1830, at a time when both sought refuge from the constraints of social convention and the limitations of received dogma. Harriet, though married, maintained a formidable reputation within the circles of progressive intellectuals. Her interests ranged from poetry to politics, and she possessed an incisive understanding of the challenges facing women in Victorian society. Mill, still reeling from the existential crisis of his early 20s, found in Harriet an interlocutor capable of both stimulating his intellect and nurturing his emotional recovery. The nature of their relationship defied easy categorization. It was grounded in mutual regard and animated by a shared passion for reform. Mill credited Harriet with expanding his psychological and moral vision, arguing that she found my nature raw and can truly be said to have formed it. Together, they contemplated questions of liberty, justice, and gender equality, blending personal experience with theoretical analysis. Their correspondence and collaboration produced some of Mill's most radical and forward-thinking propositions, including the advocacy for women's rights, a theme that would find full expression in his later work. The Subjection of Women. Harriet's influence extended beyond mere suggestion. She co-authored and edited substantial portions of Mill's essays and books, offering both substantive critique and imaginative insight. She encouraged Mill to integrate feeling with reason, pressing him to acknowledge the centrality of emotion in both private life and public discourse. Where Bentham and James Mill conceived virtue as rational calculation, Harriet modeled kindness, sympathy, and moral courage, qualities that would ultimately elevate Mill's vision of freedom from the mechanistic to the humane. The partnership was not without its challenges. Social stigma, familial opposition, and the constraints of Victorian morality cast a long shadow over their relationship. Yet their persistence in the face of adversity only deepened their commitment to each other and their shared ideals. The eventual death of Harriet's husband permitted the formalization of their bond, though it was accompanied by the sorrowful loss of years spent in separation and longing. Harriet's impact on Mill's philosophy is most evident in his evolving conception of liberty and individuality. Through her guidance, Mill came to understand that freedom is more than the absence of constraint. It is also the presence of self-development, affection, and creative fulfillment. The capacity for genuine love and emotional connection became for Mill a measure of civilization itself. He observed that the oppression of women, the stifling of diversity, and the tyranny of custom all served to impoverish the rich tapestry of human possibility. With Harriet's encouragement, Mill championed the cause of emancipation, not just for women, but for all individuals. The awakening of emotion within Mill's philosophical framework was as profound as it was enduring. It preserved the rigor of rational inquiry while opening the door to compassion, empathy, and pluralism. The partnership with Harriet Taylor stands as a testament to the transformative power of love, not merely as sentiment, but as a principle capable of revolutionizing both personal happiness and the collective destiny. Through this alliance, Mill honed the moral vision and practical sensibility that would animate his greatest works, leaving a legacy of freedom that endures in the hearts and minds of all who seek a more just and humane world. Chapter 5. The Foundations of Liberty, the Birth of a Classic. John Stuart Mill's On Liberty stands as one of the definitive treatises in the canon of political philosophy, a work whose influence stretches across centuries and continents. Published in 1859, it emerged at a moment of acute social and political upheaval, wherein the boundaries of personal freedom, collective authority, and moral progress were being vigorously contested. For Mill, the writing of On Liberty was not merely a scholarly exercise, but a moral imperative, a call to defend the autonomy and dignity of the individual against the encroachments of custom, tradition, and state power. The intellectual origins of On Liberty can be traced to the crucible of Mill's childhood, his crisis of the mind, and the transformative partnership with Harriet Taylor. Mill's philosophical vision had evolved beyond the mechanical utilitarianism of Bentham and his father, integrating insights from the romantic celebration of individuality and the moral urgency of emotional experience. The treatise was conceived as a synthesis, a rational defense of liberty grounded in both empirical analysis and ethical compassion. Mill begins by interrogating the nature and justification of social authority. He recognized that the threat to personal freedom is not limited to overt governmental repression, but extends to the subtler tyranny of public opinion, custom, and tradition. The tyranny of the majority, Mill argued, is no less menacing than the despotism of monarchs. Both have the capacity to suppress individuality, stifle innovation, and subordinate private judgment to collective will. The central task of social philosophy is thus to delineate the legitimate scope of control, preserving the inward domain of consciousness against unwarranted intrusion. At the heart of On Liberty lies the principle of self-development. Mill championed the idea that individuality is the fountainhead of progress and happiness. Free experimentation, dissent, and diversity of opinion are indispensable not only to personal flourishing, but to the collective good. He asserted that it is only by the collision of adverse opinions that the remainder of truth has any chance of being supplied. Society must, therefore, tolerate, even encourage, the broadest possible range of expression and conduct, provided it does not harm others. The treatise articulated the famous harm principle, which posits that the only justification for restricting individual liberty is the prevention of harm to others. This formulation provided a prescriptive limit to state interference, anchoring the defense of liberty in a practical, accessible criterion. The principle has since become foundational in debates over law, justice, and human rights, offering a clear demarcation between permissible autonomy and legitimate regulation. Mill's concern for liberty extended beyond abstract theory to practical reforms. He advocated for freedom of thought, speech, assembly, and conscience, for the emancipation of women, for the abolition of religious and political persecution, and for the cultivation of a vibrant, pluralistic public sphere. His writing is characterized by clarity, urgency, and moral intensity, qualities that have ensured its enduring appeal. On Liberty is notable not simply for its philosophical insights, but for its capacity to galvanize change. It challenged Victorian conventions, inspired generations of reformers, and laid the groundwork for modern conceptions of rights and democracy. Mill's defense of liberty remains as vital today as it was in his own era, a beacon illuminating the perennial struggle to balance individuality and community, autonomy and responsibility through On Liberty. Mill codified a vision of freedom that is both principled and pragmatic. The treatise stands as a monument to the ongoing quest for justice, dignity, and the unrestricted pursuit of human potential. It set the foundations upon which the subsequent chapters of Mill's philosophy and the broader movement for liberal reform would be built. Chapter 6. Freedom of thought and speech, the core of Mill's philosophy. Central to the architecture of John Stuart Mill's philosophical edifice is his robust defense of freedom of thought and speech. For Mill, the unfettered exchange of ideas was not merely a right, but a vital engine of personal and societal progress. His beliefs in this domain are most powerfully expressed in his seminal work, On Liberty, where he establishes freedom of thought and expression as the first and most important liberty. Mill's defense of free expression begins from the premise that human beings are fallible. No single individual or collective possesses a monopoly on truth, and all received opinions, however sacred, are potentially subject to error. To stifle dissent is thus to risk the perpetuation of falsehood, shielding orthodoxy from legitimate challenge. Mill's famous argument proceeds in three parts. First, that the silenced opinion may be true. Second, that even if the suppressed view is wholly or partially false, it often contains a kernel of truth necessary to correct and refine established beliefs. And third, that without open contestation, even true opinions ossify into dead dogma, losing their vividness and meaning. For Mill, the public square, whether consisting of coffee houses, pamphlets, or parliamentary debate, must remain a theatre of contestation. He addresses the anxiety that false or pernicious opinions, if widely disseminated, may harm society. While acknowledging these dangers, Mill insists that the authentication of truth requires the collision with error. It is in the testing and tempering of beliefs through debate that citizens develop their faculties of judgment, becoming not passive recipients of inherited doctrine, but active co-creators of shared knowledge. The implications of Mill's position are sweeping. He opposes the censorship of even the most unpopular opinions, provided they do not incite direct harm. Mill concedes only a few strict boundaries. Speech that incites violence or constitutes a direct instigation to harm may, in exceptional cases, justify restraint. Otherwise, the robust contest of ideas, even those regarded as dangerous or blasphemous, is necessary to the health of any open society. Mill is clear that suppression by the state is not the only danger. He sharply criticizes the tyranny of the majority, whereby dominant social conventions silence minority voices without formal censorship. Such social pressures, Mill warns, can be as insidious and coercive as official repression. The cultivation of true individuality, he argues, requires not just legal freedoms, but a culture that tolerates eccentricity and deviation. Mill's passionate advocacy for freedom of thought and speech is more than an abstract principle. It reflects a vision of the best kind of society. He believed that through contentious debate and fearless inquiry, societies could better approach the truth, foster creativity, and preserve the conditions necessary for both individual development and collective improvement. His vision anticipated and continues to challenge modern debates over free speech, censorship, and the boundaries of public discourse. As we reflect on the evolution of Mill's argument, from the salons of 19th century London to the contemporary digital age, we see that freedom of expression remains the vital core of his philosophy, a core that animates ongoing struggles for liberty and the perpetual expansion of the horizons of thought. Chapter 7. The Harm Principle, Defining the Limits of Freedom. Among John Stuart Mill's most influential and enduring contributions to political philosophy stands his formulation of the harm principle. This doctrine, meticulously articulated in On Liberty, serves as the linchpin for understanding the legitimate boundaries of personal liberty in a just society. The harm principle asserts that the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. In this single, elegant formulation, Mill encapsulates a profound and perennial tension, balancing individual freedom with the imperative to protect others from injury. The harm principle emerged as a response both to the overreach of state power and to the tyranny of prevailing social mores. Mill discerned that neither governmental interference nor collective prejudice could be given carte blanche to curtail personal liberty, except in the clear instance where one's actions threatened the well-being of another. By articulating this carefully delimited standard, Mill sought to preserve the integrity of both freedom and order. To truly grasp the significance of the harm principle, it is vital to recognize what it does not justify. Mill was unequivocal in his opposition to paternalistic constraints, the interventions by society or the state based solely on the assertion that another person's conduct is self-damaging or morally objectionable. Provided that no direct harm to others ensues, individuals are entitled to autonomy, even in pursuits considered misguided by the majority. For example, religious dissenters, bohemian artists, and unorthodox thinkers must be allowed to live according to their lights, so long as they do not infringe on the rights of others. At the same time, Mill recognized the necessity of collective action in the face of genuine harm. Laws against violence, assault, theft, and fraud, for instance, are not violations of liberty, but indispensable bulwarks that protect citizens from each other's aggression. The harm principle thus operates as a gatekeeper. It allows for the maximum sphere of private freedom, so long as these freedoms do not trespass upon the security and rights of others. Mill's approach to defining harm was, in itself, innovative and nuanced. Harm, he argued, must denote not mere offense or disapproval, but objective injury to interests that society at large has reason to protect. The distinction between private and public behavior, self-regarding and other-regarding acts, underpins the entire edifice. Drinking alcohol, gambling, or holding eccentric views may be offensive to some, but do not meet the threshold for intervention unless they produce tangible and direct harm to others, such as endangerment or public disorder. This principle's elegance belies the complexity of its application. Mill was well aware that in a world of entwined interests, drawing the boundary between self-regarding and other-regarding actions can be fraught with difficulty. Economic activities, public health issues, and moral behaviors often entail cumulative or indirect effects, raising complex questions about the exact reach of the harm principle. Yet for Mill, the guiding spirit remained unchanged. Avoid the temptation of coercion except where strictly necessary to prevent real, demonstrable harm. The harm principle's resonance extends far beyond Victorian Britain. It has become a cornerstone in modern jurisprudence, underpinning civil liberties, legal definitions of consent, and contemporary debates on issues ranging from drug use to free speech. In placing the burden of proof on those who would restrict liberty, Mill established a deep presumption in favor of freedom, a presumption that challenges both lawmakers and citizens to critically scrutinize the justifications for any interference with personal autonomy. Thus, Mill's harm principle remains a guiding light for liberal democratic societies. By defining the legitimate limits of freedom, it cultivates both individual agency and social harmony, a balance as crucial today as it was in Mill's own tumultuous era. Chapter 8. Individuality and the Pursuit of Happiness. Mill's vision of liberty is intimately bound to his affirmation of individuality as the engine of personal happiness and social progress. In On Liberty, he extols individuality as one of the principal ingredients of human happiness, and quite the chief ingredient of individual and social progress. For Mill, the cultivation and expression of individuality are not self-indulgent pursuits, but essential components of a flourishing human life and a dynamic society, rooted in his reaction against both rigid social conformity and the excesses of utilitarian calculus. Mill's emphasis on individuality marks a notable evolution in liberal thought. While utilitarianism, as advanced by his mentor Jeremy Bentham, prioritized the greatest happiness of the greatest number, Mill understood that happiness itself was inextricably linked to the freedom of individuals to shape their own destinies. Mill viewed the development of individuality as a moral endeavor. He believed that the highest pleasures and deepest satisfactions arise when people are permitted and encouraged to explore, experiment, and cultivate their unique talents, tastes, and convictions. Uniformity, whether enforced by state paternalism or social convention, creates a desert in which the human spirit languishes. Diversity, by contrast, enriches the moral and intellectual soil of society. Individuality, for Mill, carries both personal and collective significance. On the personal level, it is the crucible in which virtuous character, judgment, and creativity are forged. Individuals forced into conformity become passive and mediocre. Those encouraged to manifest their differences develop self-reliance, resilience, and the capacity for critical thought. Mill's own journey out of the suffocating embrace of his father's intellectual system underscored the necessity of forging one's own convictions through lived experience. On the societal level, individuality imparts diversity, the essential stimulus for social innovation and progress. Mill argued that the despotism of custom stifles not only the nonconformist, but society as a whole. For there is always need of persons not only to discover new truths and point out when what were once truths are true no longer, but also to commence new practices and set the example of more enlightened conduct and better taste and sense in human life. Societies that permit, even encourage, deviation and originality are likely to reap the rewards of progress and adaptability, while those that mandate conformity grow stagnant and fragile. Yet, Mill recognized that individuality must be pursued within the parameters defined by the harm principle. The pursuit of self-realization, while integral to happiness, is not a warrant to disregard the rights and well-being of others. Rather, it is in the harmonization of individuality and social responsibility that Mill locates the highest form of liberty. Each person's path to happiness is best discovered in dialogue with the wider community, tested by difference, and sharpened by shared endeavor in urging society to resist the temptation of uniformity. Mill's celebration of individuality remains a potent admonition against the creeping forces of homogenization, whether technological, political, or cultural. In an age marked by mass media, social algorithms, and globalized norms, Mill's defense of individuality as the wellspring of happiness and creativity offers both reassurance and challenge. Ultimately, Mill's commitment to individuality animates his entire philosophy. It underscores his vision of ethical life as one grounded in autonomy and informed choice. His skepticism of dogma and his tireless advocacy for a society in which each person can, with dignity and daring, pursue the good in their own way. In the dance between the individual and the collective, Mill's music is always one of liberty, variety, and hope. Chapter 9. The Role of Society When Collective Power Becomes Oppression. While John Stuart Mill recognized society's constructive role in safeguarding order and promoting general welfare, he was equally alert to the dangers posed by collective power. Mill's analysis, developed through the interplay of his philosophical commitments and political observations, illuminates the thin line separating social cooperation from social oppression. Society, in Mill's formulation, is both the crucible of individual development and the ever-present potential oppressor. The need for social structure and coordination is irrefutable. Without agreed-upon norms and mutual obligations, communities fragment and chaos reigns. Laws preventing violence or theft, the maintenance of public institutions, and the coordination of economic activity all reflect society's legitimate interests. For Mill, the question is not whether social power should exist, but how it ought to be constrained to prevent encroachments upon liberty. Central to his concerns is what he astringently terms the tyranny of the majority. In democratic societies, the will of the many, unchecked, can suppress the liberty of individuals and minorities with a zeal as destructive as any monarchy. Unlike traditional forms of tyranny, majority despotism often operates through subtle mechanisms: social ostracism, public opinion, or economic exclusion, rather than overt coercion. Mill recognized that even when the state abstains from direct censorship or intrusive regulation, the communal impulse to enforce conformity can be insidious and pervasive. This vigilance against collective power extended to his critique of moral conventionalism. Mill observed that custom, more persistent than law, exerts a compulsion that can be almost irresistible. Social conventions, whether in manners, dress, thought, or behavior, press individuals into the mold of the average, discouraging not only dissent and criticism, but innovation and diversity. The punishment for violation is often not a legal penalty, but social exclusion, a penalty no less effective for being informal. Yet Mill did not advocate for an antinomian, lawless society. He was acutely aware of the need for collective action to promote the good. His writings on representative government, universal suffrage, and the rights of labor reflect a strong belief in the power of society to address collective needs and injustices. The challenge, as he saw it, is to devise institutions that mediate these competing demands. Political checks and balances, protection of minority rights, a vigorous press, and open debate are, for Mill, essential safeguards. Mill's nuanced approach to the role of society offers perennial insight. He counsels vigilance against both governmental overreach and the tyranny of public opinion, advocating instead a civic culture rooted in tolerance, dialogue, and mutual respect. He believed that democratic societies, if properly structured, could harness collective energy without crushing individuality. His faith in deliberative democracy and participatory politics is matched by an insistence on the primacy of individual rights. In the end, Mill's analysis invites a reimagining of social power. Liberty, he believed, is most secure in societies that welcome diversity. manage collective interests through lawful means, and cultivate habits of open-mindedness. As contemporary societies grapple with new forms of both state and social coercion, Mill's vision remains a guide, a reminder that freedom and community must be held in creative tension, lest collective power decay into collective oppression. Chapter 10, Utilitarianism Reimagined, the Greatest Happiness for All. Utilitarianism, as pioneered by Jeremy Bentham and subsequently reimagined by John Stuart Mill, remains one of the most influential moral doctrines in Western thought. The principle of the greatest happiness for the greatest number lies at its heart, advocating actions that promote well-being and minimize suffering. However, Mill recognized the limitations of Bentham's original utilitarian formulation, seeking instead to infuse the theory with greater complexity, moral depth, and a profound concern for individual rights. Bentham's utilitarianism was characterized by a quantitative approach, assessing the value of pleasures and pains through a hedonistic calculus. Mill, well-versed in Bentham's ideas from an early age, perceived that such a formulation risked oversimplifying human experience, reducing the richness of life to mere numbers. In Utilitarianism, published in 1863, Mill introduced a qualitative dimension. He argued that not all pleasures are equal and that some contribute more to human flourishing than others. This qualitative distinction marks a decisive advance in the moral philosophy of happiness. Mill's reimagined utilitarianism begins with the recognition that individuals possess unique capacities for intellectual and moral development. The pursuit of happiness, in Mill's view, must account for the full spectrum of human faculties, from sensory pleasures to the joys of artistic creation, moral reasoning, and compassionate relationships. Thus, the true calculus of happiness is not merely a tally of pleasures and pains, but an assessment of experiences that elevate and enrich the human spirit. Central to Mill's ethical framework is the principle of impartiality. The happiness of each individual, regardless of status or circumstance, must be weighted equally. This commitment to universal benevolence forms the ethical foundation for justice in society. Mill was acutely aware of the risks inherent in majority rule. If not properly restrained, the tyranny of the majority could trample the rights of minorities and individuals, undermining the very justice that utilitarianism aims to secure. To counter these dangers, Mill insisted on the inviolability of certain personal liberties as necessary conditions for well-being. Moreover, Mill's conception of utilitarianism is inseparable from his advocacy of individual freedom. He argued that liberty is not opposed to utilitarianism. Rather, it is a vital means of achieving the greatest happiness. Individuals must be free to pursue their own goals, form relationships, express themselves, and challenge prevailing norms. The flourishing of the individual is the engine of progress, innovation, and collective well-being. Mill also grappled with the practical implications of utilitarian ethics for legislation and governance. Laws, he insisted, should promote happiness while respecting the autonomy and dignity of all persons. Social institutions must be evaluated not only by their consequences, but by their capacity to cultivate citizens who are capable of higher pleasures, moral reflection, and meaningful participation in public life. In conclusion, Mill's reimagining of utilitarianism abolished the narrow confines of Bentham's calculus. It invited society to consider the moral dimensions of happiness, the necessity of individual liberties, and the profound value of experiences that enrich human existence. The greatest happiness, according to Mill, demands not just the sum of pleasures, but the cultivation of a just, compassionate, and free society. Chapter 11, Higher and Lower Pleasures, Redefining Human Happiness. One of John Stuart Mill's most innovative contributions to moral philosophy lies in his nuanced account of human pleasures. Whereas Bentham famously declared that pushpin is as good as poetry, so long as the pleasure derived is equal. Mill firmly rejected this egalitarianism in the domain of pleasures. Mill's vision, articulated in the second chapter of his treatise, Utilitarianism, posits a hierarchy of pleasures and contends that not all sources of happiness are of the same moral or qualitative worth. Mill begins with a careful analysis of what constitutes human happiness. For him, pleasure is not monolithic. Lower pleasures pertain to bodily sensations, instinctive satisfactions, and basic comforts. Higher pleasures, by contrast, are those which engage the intellect, moral sense, and aesthetic appreciation. Reading literature, reflecting on moral dilemmas, enjoying fine music, or engaging in philosophical inquiry, these are experiences that Mill regards as fundamentally superior to mere sensory indulgence. To establish this hierarchy, Mill draws on the testimony of those competently acquainted with both higher and lower pleasures. He asserts that people who have experienced both tend to prefer the higher, choosing intellectual and moral activities, even if these are accompanied by discomfort or require effort. According to Mill, the capacities for elevated forms of pleasure distinguish human beings from other animals. The cultivation of these faculties is essential not only for individual happiness, but for societal progress. "It is better to be a human dissatisfied than a pig satisfied," Mill famously wrote, underscoring the dignity inherent in higher pursuits. This qualitative distinction has profound implications for public policy and moral education. Societies, Mill argues, must aid citizens in the development and exercise of their higher faculties. Education, access to the arts, and opportunities for participation in civic life are necessary for a flourishing society. If public institutions merely provide for the satisfaction of lower needs, they neglect the vital elements of personal and collective fulfillment. Moreover, Mill's account of higher and lower pleasures strengthens his defense of liberty. He believed that individuals must be free to pursue their own ideals of happiness, experiment with new experiences, and engage in creative endeavors. The imposition of a uniform standard of happiness, especially one that prizes only lower pleasures, is an affront to human dignity. Mill's theory also fortifies his utilitarianism against the charge of being a doctrine worthy only of swine. Critics argued that, by seeking the greatest aggregate pleasure, utilitarianism could justify a life devoted to base enjoyments. Mill responded that the best form of happiness is one that engages the whole person, body, mind, and spirit. He redefined happiness to encompass intellectual satisfaction, moral accomplishment, and aesthetic appreciation, making utilitarianism a far richer and more humanistic doctrine. The distinction between higher and lower pleasures infuses Mill's political, social, and educational thinking. Laws and policies are to be judged by their contribution to the cultivation of higher faculties. Efforts to reduce suffering or increase pleasure must never come at the expense of the higher joys that make life meaningful. In summary, Mill's emphasis on higher and lower pleasures reorients utilitarianism to the full spectrum of human possibility. He offers an inspiring vision wherein happiness is more than comfort, more than pleasure. It is the courageous pursuit of knowledge, virtue, beauty, and self-realization. Chapter 12, The Subjection of Women. Mill's Fight for Gender Equality. John Stuart. Mill's passionate advocacy for the equality of women represents one of the most forward-thinking and socially transformative dimensions of his philosophy. In the 19th century, women were denied the full rights of citizenship, relegated to subordinate roles within the household and society. Mill's treatise, The Subjection of Women, stands as a bold and eloquent challenge to these injustices, articulating a powerful case for gender equality rooted in moral, intellectual, and utilitarian principles. Mill asserts, first and foremost, that the subjugation of women violates the principle of individual liberty and the deepest tenets of justice. Every person, he argued, possesses the capacity for reason, moral reflection, and autonomous decision-making. The denial of these rights to half the human population stunts societal progress, deprives the world of countless talents, and perpetuates suffering. Central to Mill's argument is the claim that gender roles are not determined by nature, but are the product of social convention and historical accident. He indicts the prevailing social institutions for their systematic oppression of women, challenging the foundation upon which arguments for female inferiority rest. Mill insists that true equality requires the absolute freedom of women to choose their own destinies. Whether in education, employment, marriage, or civic life, Mill's utilitarian perspective further enriches his advocacy. A society that restricts the liberty and opportunities of women cannot achieve the greatest happiness for all. By liberating women from legal, social, and economic constraints, society would double its intellectual and creative resources, accelerating moral and cultural development. Mill's utilitarianism demands the recognition and flourishing of all individuals, regardless of gender. Mill's work as a Member of Parliament underscores his commitment to practical reform. He campaigned for women's suffrage, legal rights for married women, and equal access to education. He identified marriage as an institution fraught with inequality, wherein legal subordination rendered women little more than dependents. Only through the abolition of such structures, Mill maintained, could true partnership and companionship flourish. The subjection of women also offers a penetrating analysis of the psychological costs of oppression. Mill describes how women are conditioned to accept their subordinate status, trained from childhood to suppress autonomy, intellect, and ambition. He laments the waste of human potential and the suffering inflicted when people are denied the pursuit of their own happiness and self-realization. Mill's defense of women's rights was not without opposition. Critics accused him of undermining family, tradition, and morality. Yet Mill remained steadfast, urging that the liberation of women was essential for the moral health and vitality of society. He held up the ideal of partnership, a union based on equality, respect, and mutual growth as the foundation of both private happiness and public progress. In sum, Mill's fight for gender equality is rooted in his core principles: the sanctity of individual liberty, the pursuit of justice, and the greatest happiness for all. His work laid the intellectual groundwork for subsequent movements for women's rights and continues to provide a powerful ethical framework for the ongoing struggle against gender-based oppression. Chapter 13: Politics and Parliament. Mill as a Reformer. John Stuart Mill's career as a political reformer was marked by an unwavering dedication to the ideals of liberty, justice, and the public good. As both a philosopher and a parliamentarian, Mill forged a path that integrated high-minded moral principles with practical legislative action. His years in the British House of Commons were characterized by bold proposals, fearless debate, and an unrelenting advocacy for progressive change. Mill's political philosophy begins with the conviction that the legitimacy of any government rests upon its capacity to promote the well-being of its citizens. In On Liberty, Mill articulated the foundational importance of protecting individual rights from the encroachments of both state and society. He warned of the tyranny of the majority, the tendency of political power to suppress dissent, stifle innovation, and trample the rights of minorities. True democracy, Mill contended, must rest on the simultaneous safeguarding of personal liberty and the cultivation of public virtue. Within Parliament, Mill was an indefatigable advocate for reform. He championed the extension of suffrage, recognizing that broad participation in political decision-making was essential for justice and accountability. Mill pressed for the inclusion of women in the franchise, making him one of the earliest male voices for women's voting rights in British history. His persistent efforts to advance women's suffrage, educational reform, and civil rights placed him at the heart of the liberal movement. Mill's approach to legislation was informed by his utilitarian principles. Laws must be judged not only by their intended purpose, but by their actual consequences for human happiness. He understood that moral progress requires more than the enactment of statutes. It demands the cultivation of citizenship, the encouragement of public discussion, and the fostering of an educated and engaged electorate. In matters of economic and social policy, Mill distinguished himself as a champion of social justice. He opposed exploitative labor practices and called for the regulation of working conditions, insisting that economic freedom must be balanced by concern for the plight of the vulnerable. Mill's support for labor unions and cooperative enterprises reflected his belief in the capacity of collective action to counteract the concentration of power and wealth. Mill's commitment to liberty was not absolute. He recognized that the state has a legitimate role in preventing harm and ensuring public order. However, he maintained that compulsion and coercion must be used sparingly and only in defense of essential rights. Individual autonomy remained for Mill the cornerstone of a just society, the beacon by which laws and policies are to be measured. As a political thinker, Mill synthesized radical liberalism with principled moderation. He was deeply skeptical of enthusiasm untempered by reason, cautioning against revolutionary excess and dogmatic intolerance. Change, according to Mill, must be guided by deliberation, debate, and the careful weighing of evidence. In sum, Mill's career in politics exemplifies the fusion of philosophical ideals and legislative practicalities. He remains a model of the engaged intellectual, committed to dialogue, reform, and the unfinished work of achieving a society characterized by liberty, justice, and happiness for all. Chapter 14: Education and Moral Progress, the Foundation of a Free Society. For John Stuart Mill, education represents both the bedrock of personal development and the indispensable foundation of a free and just society. Mill perceived that the cultivation of reason, moral sensibility, and intellectual autonomy was essential to the realization of individual liberty and collective well-being. His vision of education extended far beyond the mere acquisition of knowledge. It encompassed the lifelong process of moral growth, civic engagement, and the refinement of human potential. Mill's own formative experiences deeply informed his views on education. Subjected from childhood to an intensive regimen designed by his father, James Mill, and the utilitarian philosopher Jeremy Bentham, Mill learned the value of disciplined study and critical inquiry. However, he also recognized the dangers of excessive intellectual pressure and the necessity of nurturing emotional, creative, and social capacities alongside cognitive skills. Central to Mill's educational philosophy is the development of autonomy. He argued that true education must enable persons to think independently, to challenge received beliefs, and to exercise judgment in the pursuit of truth and the good. The capacity for self-reflection, critical analysis, and moral reasoning is, for Mill, not just an individual asset, but a social imperative. Free societies require citizens who can weigh evidence, interrogate authority, and deliberate wisely. Mill believed that public education should serve as an instrument of social progress. It should break down barriers of class, gender, and privilege, providing all individuals with the tools necessary for self-realization. He opposed systems that perpetuate inequality or stifle curiosity, insisting on the need for broad access to the arts and sciences, as well as the cultivation of imagination and emotional intelligence. For Mill, moral progress is inseparable from intellectual growth. He maintained that the study of literature, history, and philosophy fosters empathy, moral discernment, and an appreciation for the complexity of the human condition. These faculties enable individuals to resist prejudice, to practice tolerance, and to contribute constructively to public life. Mill also advocated for the integration of education with civic responsibility. He saw participation in democratic processes, debate, and association as vital forms of learning. The free exchange of ideas, he argued, is not only a safeguard against error, but a means of clarifying and strengthening beliefs. Dialogue, debate, and the respectful engagement of differences are cornerstones of a healthy society. Education for Mill must never be reduced to rote learning or mechanical instruction. Rather, it should inspire curiosity, foster creativity, and encourage the pursuit of truth for its own sake. The best education enables individuals to cultivate higher pleasures, develop their talents, and aspire to forms of happiness that transcend mere material satisfaction. In conclusion, Mill's philosophy of education is a call to nurture freedom, freedom of thought, freedom of conscience, and freedom to pursue the highest forms of human flourishing. The foundation of a free society rests upon citizens who are educated not only in mind but in heart, equipped to participate in the ongoing work of justice, progress, and liberty. Chapter 15, Science, Religion, and Reason, Mill's Balanced Skepticism. John Stuart Mill's intellectual approach to science, religion, and reason reflects his characteristic commitment to balanced skepticism, the cautious and open-minded pursuit of truth across contested domains. Mill lived in an age of dramatic transformation. As scientific discoveries challenged received beliefs, religious doctrines contended with emerging secularism, and philosophical reason aspired to adjudicate between the claims of tradition and progress. Mill was a vigorous defender of scientific inquiry. He recognized the transformative power of empirical investigation, advocating for the application of reason and evidence to questions of nature, society, and morality. In works such as A System of Logic, Mill laid out a comprehensive account of inductive reasoning, emphasizing the importance of observation, hypothesis, and the systematic testing of ideas. He saw science as a means to dispel error, foster innovation, and promote public welfare. Yet Mill's support for science was tempered by a deep respect for the limitations of human knowledge. He cautioned against dogmatic scientism, the belief that empirical methods alone can answer all questions or resolve all mysteries. Mill acknowledged that ethical, aesthetic, and existential dilemmas resist reduction to quantifiable data. They demand philosophical reflection and interpretive insight. In matters of religion, Mill exhibited a stance of principled agnosticism. He was critical of religious dogma that stifled inquiry or enforced conformity. However, he recognized the enduring human need to grapple with questions of meaning, purpose, and transcendence. Mill rejected the claim that reason must supplant all religious sentiment, arguing instead for the freedom of belief and the protection of conscience. He welcomed the moral insights of religious traditions while maintaining that societal progress depends upon open dialogue, scrutiny, and the critical engagement of inherited ideas. Mill's balanced skepticism is manifest in his defense of intellectual liberty. The pursuit of truth, he maintained, requires the coexistence of competing perspectives, the tolerance of dissent, and the willingness to revise beliefs in light of new evidence. He insisted that reason and faith need not be mortal enemies. What matters is that individuals are free to seek understanding through their own faculties. Whether guided by rational analysis, ethical intuition, or spiritual vision, Mill was also keenly attuned to the psychological dimensions of belief. He understood that convictions are shaped not only by evidence, but by emotion, habit, and social environment. The attempt to eradicate superstition or error through coercion, Mill warned, risks producing only conformity without genuine understanding. He advocated instead for education, argument, and the persistent cultivation of curiosity. In the broader context of society, Mill stressed that dialogue between science, religion, and reason is crucial for progress. The refusal to tolerate difference or complexity is, for Mill, a hallmark of intellectual immaturity. He urged societies to foster debate, protect freedom of thought, and cultivate the virtues of humility and courage in the pursuit of knowledge. In sum, Mill's balanced skepticism offers a model for navigating the tensions between science and religion, tradition and innovation, certainty and doubt. His vision of reason is neither narrow nor prescriptive, but open and pluralistic, a vital resource for the ongoing search for truth, justice, and liberty. Chapter 16, Economic Freedom and Social Justice. John Stuart Mill occupies a distinctive place in the history of economic and social thought. He was a pioneer who, more than any of his contemporaries, recognized that genuine liberty must marry the principles of economic freedom with a robust sense of social justice. Unlike many liberals of his age, whose advocacy for free markets ignored problems of poverty, exclusion, and exploitation, Mill sought a synthesis. He saw in economic arrangements not merely technical constructs, but embodiments of moral and social values that shape the lives and opportunities of individuals and communities. At the core of Mill's economic philosophy lies an unwavering commitment to liberty, the right of individuals to manage their property, labor, and resources within a market economy. In his seminal work, Principles of Political Economy, Mill championed competition, voluntary exchange, and private property as engines of productivity and innovation. He recognized that under certain circumstances, the pursuit of profit and the operation of market forces could lead to prosperity and empowerment for wide sections of society, breaking centuries-old chains of feudal hierarchy and economic stagnation. However, Mill never regarded economic freedom as absolute. Unlike advocates of laissez-faire orthodoxy such as Adam Smith or David Ricardo, he perceived the market as a mechanism bounded by the moral imperatives of fairness, equity, and collective well-being. Mill consistently warned of the perils of unchecked capitalism, the concentration of wealth, degradation of labor, and perpetuation of structural inequalities. He argued that without conscious intervention, via legislation and moral reform, economic liberty could become the privilege of the few, rendering the majority subject to exploitation and dependency. For Mill, social justice was thus an indispensable counterpart to economic freedom. His proposals for reform were bold and far-sighted. He called for progressive taxation, limits on inheritance, and the advancement of cooperative enterprises as a counterbalance to the monopolistic tendencies of capitalism. He advocated expanded rights for workers, including the right to organize and share in the fruits of their labor, and championed universal education as a means of social mobility and empowerment. Though a champion of private property, he maintained that its justification lay in its utility for all, not in the sanctity of individual accumulation. Prominently, Mill's economic thought was suffused with a moral concern for human flourishing. He saw the improvement of material conditions as subservient to the broader aim of developing human capacities and expanding the range of meaningful choices available to each person. In this respect, his conception of liberty was not merely negative, the absence of restraint, but positive, the realization of human potential in a just social environment, the blending of economic freedom and social justice in Mill's philosophy laid the foundation for later developments in liberal and social democratic thought. His influence can be seen in the 20th century welfare state, the emergence of labor rights, and the articulation of social policies aimed at reducing poverty and empowering marginalized groups. He anticipated the dilemmas and debates of our own era, where stark inequality and shifting forms of precarity invite renewed questions about the proper boundaries and responsibilities of economic actors, despite accusations from some critics that his model was idealistic or riddled with contradictions. Mill's insistence on interweaving liberty and justice endures as a central challenge, for any society committed to both individual freedom and collective welfare. His invitation to reconsider not only how wealth is created, but also for whom and with what social consequences, continues to inspire policymakers, philosophers, and activists. Mill's vision for economic freedom and social justice, therefore, remains neither a static doctrine nor a mere relic of Victorian reformism. Rather, it is a living tradition, one that urges perpetual reassessment of our economic structures and moral priorities in the ongoing quest for a freer and fairer world. Chapter 17, Liberty in the Modern Age, Challenges Mill Couldn't Foresee. John Stuart Mill's treatise on liberty articulated a robust defense of individual autonomy, asserting that the freedom to act, speak, and live according to one's values is a vital ingredient in the flourishing of society. In the modern age, however, the contours of liberty, its threats and its possibilities, have transformed in ways Mill could scarcely have imagined. While the principle of liberty remains foundational, the emergence of new technologies, shifting social dynamics, and evolving forms of power present challenges that test the resilience and adaptability of Mill's ideas. In Mill's day, the principal threat to liberty emanated from what he famously called the tyranny of the majority. He feared that mass conformity, enabled by popular opinion and social pressure, could suppress individuality and reduce society to mediocrity. This insight remains prescient, yet the modern context adds new layers of complexity. The proliferation of digital technologies, particularly social media platforms, amplifies the reach and intensity of public opinion. The speed at which information and misinformation travels increases the risk of both surveillance and digital mob justice, threatening the conditions necessary for authentic individuality and dissent that Mill so passionately defended. Additionally, Mill's vision of liberty as freedom from government interference faces new scrutiny in light of modern developments. The modern state possesses capacities for surveillance and regulation that far exceed anything Mill could have anticipated. The balancing act between safeguarding liberty and ensuring security has become ever more precarious, particularly amid global threats such as terrorism, pandemics, and cyber attacks. Laws aimed at protecting citizens can easily become tools of control, challenging Mill's insistence on limiting the reach of authority for the sake of individual rights. The economic domain, too, has brought unforeseen threats to liberty. Gig economies and algorithmic management, for instance, often leave workers subject to opaque systems beyond their control. The illusion of flexibility often conceals new forms of dependency and insecurity, echoing Mill's warnings about unregulated capitalism, but underscoring fresh mechanisms of domination. Meanwhile, consumer choice, long heralded as a mark of freedom, can become hollow in the face of corporate monopolies and manipulative advertising practices, calling into question the very autonomy Mill prized. Perhaps most striking is how issues of identity, race, gender, sexuality confront the universalism at the heart of Millian liberty. Modern movements for recognition and inclusion have compelled liberal societies to grapple with the ways in which formal freedom can coexist with deep exclusions and systemic injustices. The right to autonomy, Mill believed, presupposed a basic equality of respect and opportunity. Yet persistent forms of discrimination and marginalization highlight that liberty, stripped of structural change, is often far from universal. In response to these challenges, the Millian tradition has demonstrated remarkable flexibility. The concept of liberty has been reinterpreted to address not just freedom from interference, but also the conditions that enable or impede autonomy. This so-called capabilities approach, championed by philosophers such as Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum, represents an extension of Mill's vision, identifying the concrete social and material capacities people need to exercise their freedom meaningfully. Still, The modern age demands more than adaptation. It requires a renewal of the critical spirit that animated Mill's quest for liberty. It compels us to interrogate not only the overt restrictions imposed by law or custom, but also the subtler constraints embedded within new technologies, global institutions, and cultural norms. Only by embracing the complexity of modern life, including its unpredictable dangers and its unprecedented opportunities, can we hope to sustain Mill's legacy and refine our understanding of what it means to be free today. Mill's philosophy, recontextualized and reimagined, retains its vital urgency. By tracing the dilemmas and dynamics that arise in the shadows of progress, we honor his conviction that liberty is not an artifact to be preserved, but an ideal to be pursued, unceasingly tested and tirelessly defended. Chapter 18. Criticisms and Controversies. The Limits of Utilitarianism. John Stuart Mill is perhaps best known for his reformulation and humanization of utilitarianism, the moral philosophy that holds that the right action is that which produces the greatest happiness for the greatest number. In Utilitarianism, 1863, Mill sought not only to clarify the theory made famous by Jeremy Bentham and James Mill, but also to address its perceived deficiencies, thus forging a more inclusive and flexible form of the doctrine. However, Mill's modifications did not go unchallenged. His utilitarianism provoked intense debate, inviting criticism from both contemporary and later philosophers who probed the practical, ethical, and conceptual limits of his approach. A foundational criticism targets the core consequentialist commitment of utilitarianism, the maximization of happiness or utility. Critics have often argued that by focusing exclusively on outcomes, utilitarianism neglects important considerations of justice, rights, and individual integrity. The classic trolley problem and its myriad variations illustrate the unease many feel about actions justified by aggregate consequences, even when these actions contravene fundamental moral intuitions. If sacrificing one innocent person would save 5, does utilitarian logic demand such a sacrifice, regardless of the sanctity of individual life? Mill acknowledged these dilemmas and attempted to mitigate them by emphasizing qualitative differences among pleasures and by introducing the notion of higher and lower forms of happiness. Despite Mill's efforts, the tension between collective welfare and individual rights persisted. Critics such as John Rawls have argued that utilitarianism, even in its most refined forms, fails to guarantee adequate protection for basic liberties. By subordinating individual claims to calculated assessments of welfare, utilitarianism risks justifying oppression or injustice in the name of the greater good. Mill, for his part, tempered utilitarian calculation with a robust account of personal rights, particularly in the context of freedom of expression and action. Yet, doubts linger about the coherence and stability of his attempt to mesh utilitarian ends with deontological constraints. Another area of controversy concerns the measurement and comparison of happiness itself. Bentham's original hedonic calculus envisioned a scientific approach to moral reasoning, where pleasures and pains could, in theory, be assigned numerical values. Mill recognized the implausibility of this mechanistic view and instead posited distinctions between intellectual and sensual pleasures. Nevertheless, the central challenge remains: can happiness, with all its subjective varieties and cultural influences, be meaningfully quantified and aggregated? Detractors suggest that utilitarianism, for all its intuitive appeal, rests on an unstable foundation of measurement and comparison. The charge of paternalism has also dogged Mill's utilitarianism. Although Mill vigorously defended individual liberty, critics note that his willingness to promote the higher pleasures sometimes veers into prescriptive moralism. By suggesting that some forms of happiness are inherently superior, Mill risks imposing particular conceptions of the good on individuals and communities. undermining the pluralism he seeks to protect. Finally, the shifting landscape of modern ethics, with its increased emphasis on diversity, recognition, and procedural fairness, raises questions about the adequacy of utilitarian frameworks in complex, pluralistic societies. While utilitarianism aspires to neutrality, its focus on collective welfare can obscure the lived experiences and legitimate claims of minorities or marginalized groups. Mill's belief in the progressive rational development of humanity may underestimate the forces of power, history, and misrecognition that shape moral deliberation. Nevertheless, Mill's utilitarianism retains significant virtues. It is open-ended, empirically oriented, and sensitive to change, a living morality responsive to the contingencies of human life. Its emphasis on impartiality and the reduction of suffering continues to inspire public policy and moral reasoning. Yet the controversies that surround utilitarianism and Mill's nuanced attempt to reconcile its abstract logic with the realities of moral life ensure that the doctrine remains a site of vigorous debate rather than a settled truth. Chapter 19. Mill's Legacy: The Spirit of Freedom in Philosophy and Politics. The legacy of John Stuart Mill radiates far beyond the borders of philosophical discussion, reaching deeply into the heart of political culture and public life. His ideas, forged in an era straining under the weight of industrial transformation and social upheaval, have exercised a profound and lasting influence on liberal democratic societies. Mill's philosophical innovations, the defense of liberty, advocacy for social progress, and commitment to the improvement of the human lot constitute a spirit of freedom that continues to animate debates in philosophy and politics. One of Mill's chief bequests to subsequent generations is his robust theory of individual liberty. His defense of freedom, especially as articulated in On Liberty, equipped both theorists and activists with arguments against the encroachments of authority and the despotism of custom. He championed not only freedom from state interference, a familiar tenet of classical liberalism, but also freedom from the more insidious pressures of social conformity and unreflective tradition. Mill's insistence that the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others has become an axiom for civil liberties, foundational to contemporary rights discourse. Mill's influence can be discerned in numerous arenas of political reform. His advocacy for the emancipation of women, revision of marriage laws, and extension of suffrage laid the groundwork for later feminist and egalitarian movements. His support for freedom of expression, even in the face of widespread opposition, set a precedent for the robust protection of dissenting voices, a principle enshrined today in constitutional democracies. Moreover, his nuanced attention to the balance between liberty and responsibility has shaped models of pluralist and deliberative democracy, where the cultivation of independent character is seen as both a personal and a civic good. Yet, Mill's legacy is by no means uncontested. His utilitarian defense of liberty and progress has been reinterpreted, adapted, and at times fundamentally challenged by later thinkers. Some, drawing on Marxist or communitarian perspectives, argue that Mill's individualism inadequately addresses the embeddedness of persons in social structures and the significance of collective identities. Others, inspired by postmodern or critical theory, critique the supposed neutrality and universality of Millian principles, highlighting their entanglement with particular traditions and power structures. Perhaps what most distinguishes Mill's influence is the spirit of critical inquiry and self-correction he instilled at the heart of liberal philosophy. Mill did not offer finished dogmas, but a method, an openness to evidence, to the claims of others, and to the possibility of revising one's views in light of experience. This openness, grounded in a respect for fallibility and diversity, continues to serve as a bulwark against the temptations of absolutism and dogmatism in political life. As the world confronts a host of new challenges, digital surveillance, ecological crisis, cultural polarization, the dimensions of freedom Mill explored become ever more salient. His legacy endures not as a set of fixed doctrines, but as an invitation to continual reflection on the meaning of liberty, the demands of justice, and the evolving shape of the common good. In this way, John Stuart Mill remains not only a philosopher of freedom, but a living source of inspiration for all who seek to expand the horizons of human possibility. Chapter 20. Living Mill's Vision. Freedom as a Way of Life. To understand John Stuart Mill's enduring legacy is to move beyond the analysis of his theoretical contributions and to consider the practical, lived implications of his philosophy. Mill's vision of freedom was neither abstract nor disembodied. Rather, it was rooted in the cultivation of character, the pursuit of self-development, and the lived experience of individuals within a society striving for progress and justice. For Mill, freedom was not simply a political principle. It was a way of life that nurtured human happiness and collective flourishing. At the heart of Mill's ethical project lay the conviction that true freedom involves more than mere non-interference. To be genuinely free, individuals must possess the capacity for self-direction, the ability to form, revise, and pursue their own conceptions of the good life, unimpeded by arbitrary coercion or oppressive custom. This conception of liberty, profoundly shaped by Mill's own intellectual struggles, emphasized autonomy, critical reflection, and the ongoing exercise of choice. Mill believed that human beings, when liberated from subservience to authority and irrational tradition, could achieve new heights of moral and intellectual development. This aspiration translated into specific recommendations for personal and social conduct. Mill advocated for a culture that prizes individuality, innovation, and diversity, a society in which differing ways of life are not merely tolerated, but encouraged as sources of collective strength and creativity. He warned against the stifling effects of conformity, urging both individuals and institutions to resist what he called the despotism of custom. Education, in Mill's scheme, was not simply a vehicle for transmitting inherited norms, but a process of enabling independent thought and the formation of one's own values. Living Mill's vision requires, on the one hand, a robust defense of personal liberties, freedom of thought, expression, association, and pursuit. On the other hand, it demands an ethos of mutual respect and dialogue. The freedom to disagree, to challenge and be challenged, forms the crucible within which individuals mature and societies progress. Mill's ideal of the marketplace of ideas insists that self-correction and advancement depend upon exposure to a wide spectrum of perspectives, fostering humility and openness in public discourse. At the collective level, the realization of freedom as a way of life calls for social arrangements that enable genuine autonomy for all, not merely the privileged few. Access to education, equal treatment under the law, and protections against arbitrary domination are not only prerequisites for individual flourishing, but necessary foundations for a free and just society. This places an ongoing responsibility on both state and civil society to guard against new forms of oppression and to cultivate conditions in which people of all backgrounds can thrive. Finally, Mill's vision remains deeply relevant to our time. In a world marked by rapid change, clashing identities, and proliferating forms of control, the question of how freedom can be actualized in daily life is as urgent as ever. Mill's philosophy, with its emphasis on the dignity and development of each person within a dynamic and pluralist society, serves not only as a guide to policy and politics, but as an enduring blueprint for how we might strive to live together in the fullest sense of liberty. If you found this video helpful, inspiring, or entertaining, don't forget to hit that like button. And if you're new here, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss out on future content. Your support means the world. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below.